Hi Year 10s, welcome to our next Power and Conflict Poetry lesson. This one's about Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes, and our objective is to understand the themes and the context of the poem itself. To begin with, I'd like you to take a look at these 6 images and write down how they make you feel, why they make you feel that way, and what might link those things together. So, when you're ready to start, hit the pause button, and away you go. Okay, so you should have obviously picked up on themes such as patriotism, or Britain, or United Kingdom, and potentially linking them back to what it means to be patriotic. Now, the first thing we're going to do today, specific to the poem, is look at the poet himself. So Ted Hughes was a particularly complex character and quite a controversial person in his lifetime. He was an English poet and one of the most famous ones as he became poet laureate, which means to be appointed by the Queen to be the poet of the nation. He held that title from 1984 to his death in 1998. He was born in Yorkshire in 1930, and he married American poet and novelist Sylvia Plath. However, she committed suicide at the age of just 30 in 1963, which obviously affected Ted Hughes in many ways. The causes of that are still, even to this day, up for debate. But his work has been described as being dark and brooding, so there's obviously quite a negative tone in those. And he came from a working class background, so that also would have had an influence in his style of writing. He never really enjoyed university or academia, despite being obviously clearly gifted. And his marriage was strained by the depression of Plath and his infidelity, so he was not particularly loyal person in that sense, and his lover in fact killed herself and 4-year-old daughter, possibly influenced by an obsession that she had with Plath and Hughes's reluctance to marry for a second time. So very complex and challenging individuals with a very I suppose affecting personal life. So to begin with, now we've looked at the poet himself, and we'll look at Hughes again later on. Let's start just by recapping our own knowledge. So this is a little quiz, a 5-question quiz about what you know about World War One. So you can play along live, or you can pause it when all the questions are up and try and answer them afterwards. So for question 1, how long did World War One last? Try and pick the years as well if you can. So number 1, how long did World War One last? Number 2, who was able to fight in World War One? We're specifically looking at British soldiers here, but who was able to fight in World War One? How were people recruited to join the army? So what methods were used to recruit people to join the army? Why did the First World War begin? Now, this is a very complicated answer, but if you can pick one particular event, you might pick the event that triggered World War One. And the last question is, who were the main countries involved and which side were they on? Okay, so that's your 5 questions. Either pause it now and come back to it, or you can try and see if you answered them in live broadcast. No, in real time, that's it. Okay, one thing I wanted to touch on before we carry on with the answers is that Ted Hughes, in addition to all the things we've already covered about him, was influenced somewhat by his father being a veteran of the First World War, surviving the massacre at Gallipoli, which is where a large number of British, Australian, New Zealand and South African troops were killed by the Ottoman Empire in an attempt to invade Europe through Turkey. And he was also influenced by the poetry of Wilfred Owen, who we looked at in the last lesson on exposure. But he served in the RAF, so Hughes was in the RAF, but didn't see combat by the time he was in service, and spent much of his time in that service just reading. Okay, so you ready for some answers? Okay, number 1, 5 years. Now this is a very easily misconstrued answer. So most countries recognise when the armistice between the Triple Entente and the Central Powers or Axis powers was signed, which was November 1918. However, the actual cessation of hostilities lasted until 1919, and many of the people who signed up to the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in that year, didn't in fact formalise that agreement until up to 5 years later. So technically, the United Kingdom was at war with countries from 1914 to 1923. So it was quite. It's quite a normal thing to assume 1918, when in actual fact it was 1919 for the Treaty of Versailles. Question number 2. Men of 17 years of age or older, so you only need to be 17 to fight, but in the last years of the war, younger men were taken on. Now, those men obviously, for the majority, wouldn't have been officers. They would not have been allowed into the very nascent Royal Air Force, but they would have been allowed into the Navy and the Army. So the way people were recruited was through propaganda, so political messaging, recruitment marches, which happened through many villages and towns in Britain, speeches from politicians and generals, and through the media, mainly the media being the newspapers. So the event most people associate with starting World War I was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo and his wife on the 28th of June 1914 by the Bosnian Serb separatist guerrilla Princip. The actual assassination attempt itself was a calamity of errors. If it wasn't so tragic about what happened, it would have been actually hilarious how many people completely messed up, including the driver of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand's car, the Black Hand gang that Princip belonged to and his co-conspirators. It was a shambles, and that essentially, I think, personally set up quite nicely what happened for the rest of World War I, which was broadly a shambles. And finally, question 5. The main countries involved are on the Allied or Entente side, which is Russia, France, British Empire, Italy, and the United States eventually. And on the Central Powers, that was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. So slightly different to how you might have interpreted it for the Second World War. Now, the context of this poem is that it's describing the experience of going over the top. And so this is when soldiers hiding in trenches were ordered to fix bayonets, so attach the long knives to the end of their rifles, and climb out of the trenches to charge on enemy positions. Now they could be 20 or 30 metres, or sometimes even further away. And so there'd be a long period of time of running between the trenches and being shot at. And the aim was to capture the enemy trench. So the poem describes how this process transformed a soldier from a living, thinking person to a dangerous weapon of war, and how they have changed because of that experience. So in this poem, it's describing that soldier and the battlefield and his perception of that battlefield. And that includes part of the idea of nature being destroyed by war and man, and alluding to the collapse of abstract justification. So honour and dignity are things you might think, okay, these are justifications for going to war, but when you're faced with the realities and the horror of that conflict, those become less important. So we're going to look at these keywords in a moment. So I want you to prepare for that by writing down this table. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 words. So draw this table in your books, and then when we go on to see the poem itself, we're going to come back to this, and you're going to then answer or fill in the remaining boxes. So take a sec to pause the video, copy this box down, and then replay the video. Okay. So this is the poem itself, and the first thing you want to do once you've read through it is come up with a list of things you notice before we go back to those key words. So firstly, you're going to need to pause the video to read through this and make sure you understand what's being said. Okay, so some of the things you may have read or noticed straight away, or that you immediately figure out, might be the fact that it's about soldier in action, because we talked to you about that, and you can sort of see how that is portrayed in the poem itself. You notice it's 3 stanzas. Sometimes that's relevant, sometimes it's not, but it's worth making note of these things to be helpful. We notice that it has a 8-7-8 structure in terms of its lines, and we notice that it has very vivid imagery, lots of colours and emotions in that poem. We also notice the soldier has no name. It's written in third person, and suddenly he awoke. It doesn't say a particular person's name, which may be important. So with that in mind, I want you to go back over your words and identify the literal meaning and the figurative meaning. So the first word was raw, which you see at the end of the first line. Now raw in this context might mean many things, but raw as a phrase means to be uncooked. So an uncooked meat is a raw meat, and to be raw wouldn't be the sound of a lion, because that's spelt very differently, but to be raw might also be someone who is new or a rookie at something. So we can use that in your box for literal meaning, but figuratively, what could it mean? So we look at how it's used in the poem to begin with. Suddenly he awoke and was running, raw, in raw seamed hot khaki. So khaki being the material that was a sort of light brown beigey colour the British soldiers would have worn. But to be raw in this context might suggest that perhaps it's rubbing against him in some way. It's not comfortable, it's discomfort, it's anxiety, both in terms of physicality of that material, but also emotionally. So raw, or something might also be, if something is a raw emotion, it might be something that is still sensitive. So if someone's to speak to you about something that you are still trying to get over, and it might make you think about that event or instance and cause you to feel a particularly extreme emotion. So that would be what we might write in our figurative language box. So I want you to do that for the remaining 9 words, is to go with the literal meaning and the figurative meaning, and make sure you add them in those boxes. So pause the video, come back when you've finished. Right. Part of the skill of writing poetry is to use imagery that says in literal words very little, but figuratively means a lot. So looking at the keywords you've now analysed, we want to start looking at the more extended phrases, the figurative language through similes and metaphors that Hughes uses to really create a sense of feeling in this poem, and to help us understand what it might have been like to be a soldier in this crucial, critical moment. To begin with, I want you to write as many similes and metaphors as you can find. And I've given you a couple of clues with the images on the screen now. So take a second to go over that poem again and write down any similes and metaphors before you come back, and I'll give you a few examples. Okay, the first one, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. You can almost imagine that, looking like lava bubbling out of him, this heat, the passion, but also the pain as well. So that has so many meanings to it rather than just one. And these similes are very clever in how they develop our understanding of this poem and the soldier involved. So I picked 5, and I want to just quickly touch on those that you hopefully will have written down as well. So he was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs. Well, things that make you jump up in the dark might be nightmares. It could be the sound of someone in your house. So things that normally you don't wake up because you're happy and peaceful. Normally you wake up in the middle of the night because you are afraid or frightened or compelled to do something. So that is a good simile that tells us about the fear and the compunction in this character to move and to act. His foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. So statuary is to be like a statue. So the idea of his motion, his movement that has been described all the way through that first stanza, suddenly pausing. And there is a moment where he needs to pause, either to think, to collect himself, or to make a decision. And as if there was a film being shot of this moment that suddenly stops. That tells us all kinds of things about him as a character, but also the idea that, a bit like the sensation people get nowadays, where if you're in a particularly stressful moment, like if you're in a car accident, the descriptions that people give afterwards are, oh well, everything just seemed to stop, or everything, I saw my life flash before my eyes, or something happened, a moment happened where it suddenly sort of registered how important that moment was. Number 4 is quite a tricky one. So threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame. Now, in my view, this is definitely how Hughes has described the idea of nature being destroyed by the presence of mankind. So the hair itself, yellow was a colour associated with fear and with cowardice. But in this case, I think whilst that may be true, the description of the hair tells us that it is bright and eye-catching, in contrast with the green bush that's behind it in this particular scene. And rolled like a flame, as if it's being destroyed or consumed by fire. Perhaps it's rolled because it's been shot by the bullets, rather than it jumping away because it's afraid. It's as if it's rolled or lolled or fallen, as opposed to sprung or jumped or leapt. So the word choice again is very key. And lastly, and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide open silent, its eyes standing out. So to personify that in a way that makes it seem as if it is shocked and distraught and surprised by its death and its the horror of that, as if the hair itself is reflecting back on the soldiers this horror of war and what's happened to them. And it in fact could be quite comparable in this case with some of the portrayals of victims of mustard gas, which was also yellow. So in this way, you could link it perhaps back to exposure and how the portrayal of the men at the end are sort of as clearly dead in comparison with this hair which has been killed as well, and their sort of twisted facial expressions. Okay, that is it for today. So why has that got? We're going to fix this live. Are you ready? So you get to see behind the curtain of how this actually gets done. For some reason, oh yeah, that last one's hidden. Right, done. So that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed that lesson. There'll be a little bit more about power and conflict as we go through. Start thinking as well. I mentioned at the end exposure comparing with Bayonet Charge, and I think it's important that now we've seen a couple of those poems, you'll have seen a couple of other lessons, that you start thinking about ways you can connect them together. So we're going to talk about nature in many ways as being a key aspect of the power and conflict anthology theme, and already we've talked about nature here. We've talked about how nature has been presented in Storm on the Island, and we're going to come to those things specifically around, I would suggest, around Kamikaze and perhaps the Prelude. So again, thanks for watching this video. Please do subscribe and support us, and we'll try and get more videos out for you to help your continuing education as we go, even if it is from the comfort of your own home. Thanks very much. Bye.